Do you remember this moment in 2020? What?
That's just my summer of 2020 noise. That's my
Okay.
despair at the summer of 2020 noise.
Do you remember the summer of 2020 when you didn't make the noise? I don't know what to do.
It's going to go differently every time we do it.
Okay.
That's the nature of live recording.
Okay. So I've been thinking about the summer of 2020,
Oh my God.
which we've all kind of forgotten now, right? But there was this moment in the summer of 2020 when COVID was this pandemic that had happened to everyone. And it felt like by that summer, people could see all of the ways that the world was broken and that the reason that the pandemic was so terrible was because of all the ways that the world was broken. I mean, most notably, right, there was the murder of George Floyd and the protests that followed, picking up on the racial disparities in the pandemic itself.
Yeah, and there was the attempted kidnapping and assassination of Gretchen Whitmer. That's a greatest hit, and plus all the counter protest, Operation Gridlock, all the economic harms that were being suffered by people across the political spectrum.
Right, especially the government's lack of any kind of planning for or protection for caregiving laborers, the highly visible exploitation of essential laborers. And there was also that way that within a couple weeks of the pandemic, the skies cleared, the waters cleared, and the harms to the planet of our way of life became highly apparent. And yet, in that moment, in the summer of 2020, the only kind of leadership that we were getting was political leaders saying, let's get back to normal.
And it's always kind of like that. I mean, this is my thing, having gone through a lot of these disasters to a greater or lesser extent. There's always some guy in a suit and a microphone saying, let's build back, or even let's build back better. And then there are a lot of survivors who are standing there saying, like civil rights leaders said during COVID, we can't go back. We don't want to go back to normal. We died in normal. Normal was killing us. The way of life in normal was discriminatory. It was oppressive. It was beating us down 6 ways to Sunday. But yeah, our disaster response always pulls us back.
And so this happens in a lot of disasters, but I think it's particularly apparent in COVID because of the way that the COVID-19 pandemic affected all of us. And so it produced this kind of widespread awareness of this kind of brokenness, right?
Yeah. And I think it showed us how ridiculous in some ways our disaster policy is. I have kind of a rant about this, right? This is where a lot of the energy for this came from for me. At this point, all of us, everybody listening to this podcast has been through some shit over the past few years, disaster wise, whether it's COVID or these massive heat waves or wildfires, massive storms and rainfall that are happening. And if you're out there and you feel like it's breaking us as a society, we think you're right. We had done enough work on this before COVID, starting with the Haiti earthquake, a dozen years ago, to know that how you handle disasters can fracture you, can make everything much worse than it was before if you don't fix these problems that are revealed in it. And I don't mean we have to get better at how we handle disasters. I don't mean more like preparedness trainings or fucking go kits or something. I mean the way we handle disasters is actively harming our society. We've got to change it.
It sounds like you're saying the way that we understand disasters is harming our society.
Yeah. The way we think of disasters as we had a good, solid society, and then it broke, and we've got to build it back is wrong. And it's really been an American or a neo-Enlightenment phenomenon the last couple hundred years. We've got to throw out that thinking, because otherwise this century of disasters where we're getting hit time after time after time is going to break us down. And that's it. Congratulations. It's depressing, but that's what this podcast is about. I'm Mitch Strickland, an emergency manager.
I'm Dr. Jordan Pascoe, a feminist philosopher. This is Tough Shift, a podcast about how disasters change us
and why we need to change how we respond to disasters.
So this season on Tough Shift, we are going to talk about what it means to reimagine what we think a disaster is and how we handle them. We're going to wrestle with these questions with philosophers, emergency managers, practitioners, and disaster scholars. Maybe we'll convince you, maybe we won't, but we're pretty clear that this is the problem that we have to solve.
In this first episode, we're bringing back an old friend, my co-Duke, Andrew McMahan, now at NYU, to sort of talk us through it and lay some groundwork for a season. And every episode, we're going to tell a little bit of the story. Piece by piece, we're going to try to fit it together. And I hope you'll come with us on this crazy, depressing, but ultimately, we think, hopeful journey.
So let's talk about the book. This is amazing. It's called The Epistemology of Disasters and Social Change.
It has a long title.
It does.
That means it's very smart and important, right? If it's got a long title. That's what I know about books.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Pandemics, protests, and possibilities. So you both started thinking about this back Hurricane Charlie. Is that right?
I did.
So this has been you've been noodling on this for a long time.
A long time ago, when Mitch was like a little boy emergency manager.
Take us back.
Yeah.
You were wearing like a little beanie and
that's right, with the little
shorts on,
the things that spun around on the top. And I was in Florida. And my first job after Hurricane Charlie was shutting down community food kitchens. Right. After a disaster, everybody cleans out their fridges and then they go around sharing food with each other. And the state of Florida was like, we got to shut it down for food safety concerns. And it was so
your job was to deny people food.
That's right. That's right. That was my emergency management role, to go around saying, sorry, you can't eat
survivor.
That. And listen, food safety is important. I'm not a fan of E. coli, right? Who likes that stuff? But it was like such an expression of them showing love and trying to build a new kind of community. And it was so powerful. And I was a little bit like, I love this work. I love disaster response. I love the planning, but like, what are we doing? Like, is this what we should be doing for these communities? And I kind of started thinking why. And the answer to the question was always like, well, we want things to get back to normal. And so we don't want these people serving food to each other. We want them to go to approved restaurants. We want them to go to approved food sources. I mean, as one example in the bigger thing. Yeah. And it was kind of like, but isn't it awesome what they're doing? Like, couldn't that energy be used to make that community more like caring and forward thinking and more cohesive, right? Mm-hmm. But the answer was no. They were like, put your beanie back on and go stand in the corner.
Well, so there were a lot of disasters between now and Hurricane Charlie. So how did kind of subsequent disasters affect this or move you or, continue to have you think about this?
Well, I mean, when I came up here, actually, I met Jordan in a bar one night after H1N1 planning.
Nice.
So 2009, we were doing massive H1N1 planning for like the second wave.
I was there.
Yeah.
Let the record state.
That's
you and
right.
I were working together.
We were working together in that we were in that office with I had a little desk in the middle and we had like these offices around it. I had a sliding door that I used as dry erase board, but
zero privacy.
It didn't work as dry erase board. Like I was trying to be all beautiful mind and be like, oh, look at the plans. And then I was like, oh shit, this doesn't erase. And we were doing that one day. And then I left and met Jordan at the bar. And we spent all night talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the Rwandan genocide. Mm-hmm. That was our night.
As you do.
Yeah.
On a first date.
That was the first date. Yeah. That was our first date conversation. And it was amazing. And so we started.
Let's hear Jordan's perspective of that. Jordan, first date with Mitch. He brings up the Rwandan genocide.
No, that was me. Oh. I was teaching a class on the Rwandan genocide. I know. And he showed up and he was like, what are you reading? And I was like, just this book of testimonies from the Rwandan genocide. And he was like,
I love you. Will you marry me?
That was pretty much it. I didn't have to do anything else after that. He was completely here for it. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I knew much about disasters at that point. I mean, I had been in New York for 9/11, and I had also been in New York for the 2003 blackout, during which I tried to start a community food kitchen. I mean, a very small one.
Mitch shut you down.
I should have shut you down.
Yeah, I stood on St. Mark's Place with a friend's bag of avocados and yelled for the ingredients for guacamole until people came out of their apartments and brought the ingredients for guacamole. And we made a giant bowl of guacamole and everyone ate it, which in a post-COVID world seems nuts, but we did, and it was great.
That's awesome.
So I'm very here for disaster community kitchens.
Now I super want guacamole.
I know.
Also. And Jordan, your background is in why don't you tell us what your background is? Because it's very unique to crisis management.
And also, neither of us can explain it ourselves. So really,
that's fair. So I'm a feminist philosopher. And so when I met Mitch, I was finishing my doctorate and I was writing about the history of philosophy. We didn't have a lot of crossover in what we were doing. So actually the point where we started really talking about disasters was after the Haitian earthquake in 2010, because I was doing research on the Haitian Revolution. And Mitch was thinking about it from a disaster perspective. And we suddenly found that we had sort of a set of resources for thinking about what was going on that were really complementary to each other. And I think those were some of our earliest conversations about how the way that I work on and think about the world and the way that you work on and think about the world could really be in conversation.
Because after the Haiti earthquake, one of the emergency management things was that the State Department took over the airport. Mm-hmm. And so you're watching the State Department and FEMA sent assets down there. And what they did was they took over the airport and they made you fill out a form to send planes in. And the planes they sent in were security planes because the State Department believed that there was a security situation. And so they prioritized a battalion of soldiers over all of the food aid that was being sent in. So for 72 hours, the airport brought in airlifted soldiers, but not food aid. Mm-hmm. And all of these organizations around the world protested. And then they invested in all of the security infrastructure, all of these armed forces, but they never invested in water sanitation systems. They didn't build infrastructure. And then you had a cholera outbreak a year later.
Yeah. And so around that time, Hurricane Sandy happened. And partly as a result of that, I started teaching a class on the ethics of disaster, which was super fun. Mitch used to come in and give talks in that class. And I taught that every semester for years. And so through building that class and engaging with that, we started thinking about it, I think, much more consistently. We wrote and presented a few papers.
Although we did actually, we had our first flood also. Hurricane Irene was really important for our relationship because Jordan's apartment flooded. And so she moved in with me like 6 months before we got married. And so, it worked out well for me. I'm just saying, but she had to move in with me and my two young children, into our 2-bedroom apartment. So, yes. But that was the first of the many floods that we've gone through in our relationship.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so you talk a little bit about how COVID really changed things in your mind about how you view disasters. So could you talk a little bit about what was that change and how COVID kind of shifted your thinking about this?
Well, I think up to that point, we had been largely thinking about disasters from sort of ethical perspectives, partly because that was most of the existing literature on disasters was really focused on these ethical questions. And we had started to run into the edges of that. I mean, when we were writing about Haiti, we were starting to think about the ways in which we needed resources for understanding how the responders were showing up with one set of resources for literally understanding and conceptualizing what was happening. And that didn't necessarily line up with the experiences and the testimony of people on the ground. And so we started to think about sort of, what philosophers would call decolonial questions through that. And that started to push us in the direction of thinking about epistemology or questions about how people know, how people understand the world. And I think if I'm right, the first piece that we put together on that was actually for the health department.
Yeah. So before COVID, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, I deployed down to the Virgin Islands for a while, and we put together like an ethical guide for responders, partly because my experience of going to the Virgin Islands was, so many great people, so many great, dedicated, passionate folks going there to try to do good, but they were coming in and they just knew what was right. Like they knew what they'd been trained. They were ready to deploy. They had the capabilities set up, and they would go in and they'd be like, here's the capabilities here. And if it didn't match the local culture, it was like they couldn't see it. It was invisible. Mm-hmm. And so we were trying to figure out how do you train somebody to go into a situation and come with humility, which certainly other people in emergency management have tried to do, but it didn't click. Like it didn't seem to be something, it was weird. It didn't seem to be something you could like teach.
Yeah.
And I remember I was like down there, but I was on like the FEMA cruise ship, which everybody after Irma and Maria can remember their FEMA cruise ship deployment. And I went out one night with this group of emergency managers from all over. And one of them was like, he was like, it doesn't matter. He was like, whatever we do here, these people are just gonna, you know, they're gonna fuck it all up, and we're gonna be down here again in 6 months. And people were like
nothing will change.
Yeah, the same thing. Yeah. But it was partly nothing will change because we're not trying to change it, right? And so we kind of were like, it's not even thinking about ethics, even trying to encourage people to do better when they're there, even changing the procedures we use in emergency management, like it wasn't effective. It didn't go far enough.
So did that ethical guide that you put together turn into this book, or is it used in the book?
Yeah,
or was it?
It's in there, right? All the virtue ethics.
Well, because I think part of what we did in that guide, part of the big shift for us that offered was that, you know, there's this move in feminist philosophy to start thinking in terms of epistemic virtues, by which we mean sort of like, what kind of habits as a knower do you need to develop in order to have humility, in order to be sensitive, right? And so we were starting to think, well, maybe it's not so much the sort of virtues of action that you're bringing, but the virtues of knowledge that you're bringing. And so that was in the guide, this sort of idea that like you couldn't necessarily train people on where you're going because things move so fast in a disaster, right? There's a limit to how much of that you can do, but you could train people in how to approach not knowing things. Just like a classic philosopher question, right? How do you know what you don't know? How do you know that you don't know that you don't know something, right? That those questions, we realized those seem to be kind of like the key orienting questions that could maybe reshape a little bit of how things went on the ground.
Which brings me to the problem with all this, which is, I think, the word epistemology. Yeah. Right. And I'm going to inaugurate right now with my backup beer an epistemology drinking game.
Nice.
Or epistemic. Epistemic counts too. Right. Because it's like every time you say that, for me, okay, epistemology, to get through the 21st century, epistemology is going to have to be a tool set that emergency management needs to use like logistics, like anything else in our pocket. We've got to understand how people see disasters, how they experience those disasters, and how those disasters change what they think about the world. And we've got to figure that out, and you've got to use epistemology to do that. But it's like, I wish there were a shorter word. You know what I mean? Yeah. But that was the tool set that we really had to go to get to these questions. And I said it 3 times, so I'm going to drink.
Yeah, no, if we have to drink every time we say epistemology, this is going to get,
be a problem. I'm not putting that on you. I'm just for myself.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. Well, and and what I'll say about it is that within philosophy, I mean, epistemology it's the study of knowledge of how people know, right? And I think you're absolutely right that that's going to be a key toolkit in terms of thinking about how we know and understand disasters, but also just like how people's relationship to like facts and truth is deeply under threat. And so these questions of like, what's a reasonable belief? These seem like absolutely essential questions for us in the 21st century. But part of how we were coming to this is that one of the fastest growing fields in philosophy in the 21st century is feminist epistemology, which are questions about justice and injustice in how people make knowledge and how background conditions of injustice, oppression, and social power and social relationships inform what kinds of knowers we are, what kinds of knowledge we make, and how we understand the world. And so that was the toolkit that we realized we weren't seeing a lot of threads of picking up that toolkit in thinking about disasters. And so that was the toolkit that we wanted to bring to the table.
That's what I love about the book, is it's bringing in these concepts that traditional crisis managers have not been exposed to. And it's providing us a new way to look at response, resiliency, recovery. And I think you talk to a crisis manager, they would all admit something is broken, something is not working. The world is changing. We're getting more, you talk about this in the book, more expensive disasters, billion-dollar disasters. Those are happening more frequently. So what are we doing wrong? And at the same time, you have crisis managers are familiar with things, planning assumptions. When you're writing a plan, for this plan, we're going to assume that these things will happen. You brought up the blackout. This blackout that happened in the 70s in New York City, there were riots, there was crime, there was robbery, there was looting, the one that happened in 2000. So that was the assumption, these crisis managers, of next time we have a blackout, we're going to go through this again. what happened in 2003?
We made
guacamole on the streets and everybody shared their food, you know? And so like in between that time, you also had 9/11, you had a bunch of hurricanes, you had disasters. So you talk about this a little bit, how these big disasters can go one way or the other. They can kind of break down society, or they can change things for the better. And it also doesn't constantly go up or go down. It can kind of change in between. So could you talk a little bit about like that and kind of the trends of disasters? And
yeah, I think this is the super depressing part of this for me, okay? Which is...
No, I'm going to drink.
No, that's right. Which is... The problem is, for us, looking at the way we respond to disasters, the way we prepare for them, they do provide these opportunities for change. There are these little windows that open where people shift how they know the world, and either things can get better, you can grow cohesion, you can paradise built in hell, the way Rebecca Solnit talks about communities coming together, or as we saw kind of during COVID, things can get much worse. And I think a lot of us woke up partway through COVID and thought, what world are we in now,
mm-hmm.
right? Why does it seem so dystopian? Why can't we find our way back? And part of that is obviously the politics we're living in. It's part of American society. But part of it is the ways we chose to respond to COVID broke us apart and broke our connection to truth in different ways. And there's this guy, Christopher Dyer, who's an anthropologist, who studied the Exxon Valdez, right, which was an oil spill in the late 80s in Alaska. And he followed the communities that were impacted for decades. And what he saw was that every time a disaster hit them and resources came in, all these really well-intentioned resources, trying to fix them, trying to help them, and if they weren't culturally appropriate, if they didn't focus on this question of strengthening the community, right, bringing everybody together, which they never did because federal resources aren't incentivized to do that, mm-hmm. right, the community would break apart a little more. It got a little weaker, until after 15, 20 years, it stopped functioning as a society. The people there no longer had relationships. They no longer had communities. And he said, and this is the depressing part, that could happen to the entire world based on disaster by disaster. If we keep responding in inappropriate ways that don't strengthen communities, we can break our entire society this way. And I feel like we took some really terrible steps in that direction during COVID, that we're more broken now, precisely because of the ways we map out in the book, things can go really wrong. So basically we're talking end of the world type stuff, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
But you also talk about how things can change for good, right? After disasters. So talk about that. What were some of the examples you found where disasters happened and things changed for the better? And why was that? Did you identify like key indicators of like, oh, this is why things went better?
Dude, yes.
Mitch wasn't shutting down community kitchens.
Yeah, I mean, that was in many ways the big question that we were motivated, I think, to answer, was this question of sort of like, okay, it does seem like there's general agreement that disasters produce social change. It seems like sometimes, like there's this story that they produce positive social change. You can think of that as like the Rebecca Solnit story. And mm-hmm. then there's the story that they produce punctuated entropy, right? That they produce disaster capitalism, right? That they crack things apart. And, we started from the assumption that both things were true. And part of this was that we were formulating and writing this book through COVID. And so it felt as though both things were often true simultaneously in the world right in front of us. But, I will say that we got to a point where our guiding star for this book, the person whose writing we came back to over and over again as we were thinking about it, was Audre Lorde's writing about surviving Hurricane Hugo in St. Croix in 1989. And she writes, it's an important piece of her later career. She writes an essay, which is a series of letters about her experience. She writes several poems about it. And she ultimately revises some of her earlier poems sort of in the wake of Hurricane Hugo. And Lorde gave us, I think, a couple of things. One thing that Lorde helped us to understand is that, she was new to St. Croix when Hurricane Hugo, relatively new to St. Croix when Hurricane Hugo hit. It was absolutely utterly destructive of the island. And for her, it was a huge wake-up call. And this is somewhat surprising because we're talking about 1989, right? She's been Audre Lorde for decades.
She lived on Staten Island, for God's sake.
Right, like she's maybe the most, she is one of our most nuanced thinkers on oppression and injustice. And yet, when Hurricane Hugo hit St. Croix, she was like, "Oh my God, I'm an American, and this is a colony."
Wow!
And for her, it was this sort of huge perceptual shift, which we talk about in the book, right? This idea that one of the things that disasters do is they offer these kind of revelations about the, right, like the Canadian poet Dion Brand called this the endoskeleton of the world, right? That like what disasters do is they sort of reveal the skeleton that's holding everything up the rest of the time, right?
Yep.
And the fact that that's true, even for Audre Lorde, was something that we really sat with and really thought about. And so for her, this became a moment where she repositioned herself in the world. She remapped her understanding of how she was located in the world, how she was located in relationship to, American colonial oppression, what it meant to experience a disaster like this in St. Croix rather than on Staten Island. And so that was one thing. One thing was that Lorde gave us this way of thinking about the fact that like no one is exempt from the ways that disaster can change these perspectives. But I think the other thing is that in reading Lorde's poetry, especially the poems she wrote after Hurricane Hugo, there is this refusal to land in bleakness. There's this always in every poem, this fight, this move at the end, this turn towards what is possible, this turn towards the ways in which the darkness of any situation can offer a pathway forward. And so we decided at some point that was going to orient us in the way that we were going to think about disasters, that we could not write a book about punctuated entropy that was going to assume that the end of the world was inevitable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what she did, first she was struggling with cancer at that time, but she used her energy for mutual aid. She invested in her community. She started feminist programs on St. Croix. She tried to bring everybody towards a little more liberation. What she was saying was America, the structures of it were destroying them almost without thinking about it, without consideration. And the reason was she aimed it towards nostalgia. She said America breeds nostalgia the way rabbits breed bunnies, which is like one of my favorite ones. And the thing was that the nostalgia, which we have in recovery, like when we recover, even when we're building back better, we're still building back.
Yeah.
And we're building back towards a memory of how we imagine the world. But that memory is baked in with white supremacy and structural racism. Like we're trying to build back a world that is imagined by the most privileged people. Even when we're fighting against it, even when we're trying for resilience and trying for equity, we're still working within these broader structures of our imagination of a disaster as something that destroys property owners, that breaks sort of this established social infrastructure, and we're trying to get back to it. And for her, that nostalgia was tied in with colonialism, because even the idea of St. Croix as a colony was something that like the United States has imagined and created, right? It created this as this colonialist space. And so the only way to get out of it in her writing is to pivot, is to think about the future, to use the crisis as a break opening of those structures, to move us towards a future that we have to imagine ourselves.
Yeah, I love that. You've got a lot of great Lorde quotes in here. The poem you open with is amazing. I think every crisis manager should have that tattooed on their back. My back is already full of tattoos. There's a big American eagle there, but maybe I'll have room somewhere else. You also talk about Samuel Prince, who went through a disaster in Canada, and he seems to have maybe broken through and really changed things for the better here. Could you talk a little bit about kind of what he did? By the way, later in the book, when you talk about Prince and you quote Prince, I was thinking it was the musician Prince. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know Prince said that. No, it was.
That's a real problem actually in our book, the lack of Prince lyrics.
Yeah,
like we really
should. That's my one critique.
For the sequel, we really got to lean on that Prince.
For the movie,
Prince and Prince together.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
Yeah, Samuel Prince and Purple Rain. That's the way it's got to go. So, Sam Prince, it's funny because...
So, what did he create after? Can you tell a little bit about the disaster and then what he created after?
So, the biggest non-nuclear explosion ever in the history of the world was in Halifax, Nova Scotia during World War I, essentially. It was an ammunition ship that blew up and destroyed a chunk of Halifax. And he was a minister there. He was sitting having breakfast, I think, in his room when it exploded. He ended up running his church, turned his church into a shelter, and then later went to Columbia, wrote a dissertation about the experience. And in that dissertation, people consider it the first work of disaster sociology. Now, I'm not a disaster sociologist. There are lots of people with more expertise in that than I am. But he said disasters always bring social change. But he said that you don't know if that change is going to move you forward or backward. It depends on what happens. And a lot of later scholars have disagreed with that, right? A lot of people have this idea that disasters bring social change is controversial. And part of that for us is because the United States, more and more as it puts in procedures, our procedures are actually designed to prevent social change from happening. We reimburse people based on the pre-storm value of their homes, right?
So it's this going back to how things were. Make things great again,
right?
The way it was.
And the more you do that, the emergency management procedures themselves serve to stop social change. So I think we started to see sort of less social change in disasters as emergency management infrastructure ramps up. Part of that is good because you're recovering, you're putting more money into things, but it prevents the natural sort of healthy change that also helps communities grow after disasters, in our opinion, that the stuff Sam Prince saw in Halifax. And by stopping that, for us, you're putting a lid on an explosion, you're like preventing natural social change from occurring, and you're not letting disasters prompt that sort of better change that they could prompt, right?
Yeah.
Should I say the word epistemology just to see if I'm still...
That's just because you want to drink more.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, and I think that, again, we wrote this book, we were thinking about this through and after COVID. And my sense is, one of the things about COVID is we're all disaster survivors now, right? And I find this very useful in talking to people about this, because I think we all experienced, there were parts of COVID where there were forms of change that were tremendously hopeful and felt like a tremendous relief, And those maybe aren't the parts that have had the most lasting effects. In some ways they have, in some ways they haven't. But I think we've all now lived through a disaster where we can see the way in which that kind of change feels so necessary, right? It feels like what you have to do in order to show up in the disaster, in order to survive the disaster. And so that was a large part of what was pushing us, was really this question of like, what are the phenomenological or the experiential things that are happening to people in disasters that are leading to this strong desire for social change? What brings people together? What leads to new kinds of coalitions and communities forming? And, and what possibilities can that birth within a framework of understanding that, as Mitch says, a lot of our response mechanisms are designed to shut that down, like Mitch closing down the community kitchens, right? But when I stood on that street and I called out for the ingredients of guacamole, people were here for it, right? And that's sort of a silly disaster a little bit, the 2003 blackout. But I think that a lot of us experienced this in COVID, right? There are just so many stories of mutual aid groups springing up, right? Communities coming together to check on members of their community who they'd never met before, but suddenly in lockdown are looking in on one another. And
also that, we built this whole safety net, even governmentally during COVID. We had childcare and unemployment tax credits and all of this stuff. And then we broke it. We got rid of it to put things back to normal. And I think there is a way that you could imagine another world where the energy of COVID helped sustain the mutual aid, sustain this new safety net, and moved our country towards a more equal footing, which, just by the way, after the 1918 pandemic, that response prompted socialized medicine in Europe. A lot of countries in Europe looked at what happened in the pandemic in 1918. They said, look at the horror we all suffered together. Let's come together and build a socialized medicine infrastructure. And it took them decades, but they did that because they'd experienced the pandemic together. But in this country, we were kind of like, well, that's over.
Right.
Let's
go back to
paying the doctor
money in the
$50.
insurance.
Yeah.
Let's just give women the vote and call it a day.
That's right.
That's also what Samuel Prince did. What musician Prince did, right? He created this social structure to support people who, were victims of disasters, right? Wasn't he the father of like the Canadian welfare system?
Yes. Yeah, he was. It was amazing. That's right. He it was part of his experience in Halifax. Yeah. He was like, we can come together for the common good. And he made it his life's mission. That's right. And, musician Prince did too, right? Paisley Park will always stand as a disaster resilience, monument for all time.
It's very interesting because, one thing I've seen is that survivors of disasters, they are invested in recovery. We will rebuild, right? We're coming back. And so there's this energy and momentum too. They're not giving up. They're not letting go. But it's like you said, there's the bureaucracy of the government that comes in that kind of forces them to build it back to the way it was, again, because they don't want the societal change. So I think that's a fascinating observation. And it almost like mutes the survivor's ability to bring about that change.
Yeah, this is, I think, where the feminist philosophy is really structurally important for our argument, because we're really interested in this idea that what we know, what plans we make, reflect whose opinions, whose testimony is part of the production of like shared knowledge, right? And so that example, part of the problem that we're identifying is this question of, well, whose voices were heard when those plans were being made, right? And what are the mechanisms for making knowledge? And one of the things we think a lot about is the way in which disasters are a really interesting place to ask this question, because knowledge making in disasters is just happening at speed. Mm-hmm. We think a lot about the speed of disasters in the book and the way in which, the example of creating an entire social net during COVID is a great example. That would never have happened, right? And if we could win those fights, imagine how slowly we would win those in a non-disaster context, right? Whereas in COVID, we built those programs and activated them incredibly quickly. Yeah. And so the question of whose voices are being heard when we're moving that quickly? And part of our thesis is that disasters, in some senses, create opportunities for new voices to get uptake in those kinds of processes. And then also that in other ways, for example, through top-down responses, those voices get shut out even more rigorously than they might do at other times. And so this is also really, I think, a question for democratic deliberation and democratic reasoning, right? We're asking a question about whose voices get heard. What are the structures through which people's voices get heard that shape the kinds of policies that we're going to see in disasters? And I think COVID is a really important lesson in this, in that we did create a whole social safety net during COVID at speed. And if we're going to live in a world of continuous and ongoing disaster, which I think we are, right? Doesn't seem like that's slowing down, right?
Oh, disasters aren't over?
It doesn't. I know.
It's done. We had turned Season 4 was the final one.
We turned
jumped the shark with disasters, right? Yeah. But I think a lot of the ways in which we are likely to get significant policy changes are likely to be in response to disaster. So these questions about whose voices get uptake and what kinds of policies they shape are super important questions for disaster, but I think also super important questions for the future of democracy.
Politics and democracy. It reminds me of when I had really bad anxiety, and one of the tips that the doctor told me was to wear a rubber band, and if you're spiraling, to just snap the rubber band to just kind of get you out of that.
Right.
It's to shock the system, kind of to oh yeah, right. Wait, this isn't that big of a deal. I'm fine. But it's funny how disasters kind of do that. They shock you, and you're like, wait,
and
things are not good.
As things get more polarized, as there seem to be fewer ways of connecting, for us, disasters are one of those increasingly rare times that people can come together. So it creates a rare window for positive change, right? So even in the next decades, as polarization increases, we still see so much human feeling around these disasters. Mm-hmm. And the trick is how to honestly, not trying to be cynical about it, but honestly letting that build the sort of community cohesion of our society. As an emergency manager, right, I was really worried about working in epistemology. Okay, and I'll drink later because I'm going to emphasize the importance of this point because it's so abstract, right? And I've had a lot of conversations with my friends in the field who were so ticked off by academics writing about emergency management stuff. And I don't mean emergency management practitioner academics. I mean like theorists writing critical theory books about disasters
like philosophers.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to call you out. I was trying to be nice about it.
Jordan. Like feminist philosophers.
Just waltzing into emergency management.
Writing
I don't want to make it awkward. Okay. We'll see if our marriage survives this. But honestly, I think that's actually, it's true in a lot of, because I think as emergency managers, and even though I'm now in an academic institution, and I have to own that, going through the responses of disasters, going through that process is a really formative thing. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to write something that I didn't feel like I could execute in some way. Yeah. And so in the middle of the book,
in the middle of the book, you have the IAP template for.
That's right.
I just couldn't resist it.
I know. No, yeah. I think we really need that. We need the situation report that includes current epistemological status.
The 204.
96%.
Yeah.
That's what.
Okay. Sorry. Get back. No, in the middle of the book.
That we chart the 1985 Mexico City earthquake for a couple of chapters. We spend a lot of time on it. There's a set of psychological responses to disasters that D.D. Myers and others charted, where it sort of shows people. There's a heroism phase where people come together, and then there's a honeymoon phase where people are feeling good. There's a disillusionment phase where things fall apart, and we sort of tracked that earthquake through those phases to look specifically at the choices the response is making at each part that shifts the society one way or the other. And that earthquake, a lot of thinkers have talked about it as really prompting real democracy in Mexico for the first time. And the story that sticks with me that I think about all the time is this woman, Evangelina Corona, who was a seamstress. She was a garment worker. And when the earthquake happened, she was trapped up on the 6th floor of her building with all of the sisterhood of other garment workers. And they couldn't get out. Doors were locked. And they used the garments that they had woven to make a rope that they could slide down out of the building on. And then they were there, and they were surrounded by hundreds of their colleagues, all of whom were crushed under rubble. Then they were listening to their kind of screams and groans as they died. And they stayed there. And their boss came. And their boss said, "I'm going to help get these people out of the rubble, but I need you to get me my equipment first from it. And if you get my equipment out of the building, I'll help you rescue these people," because there were all kinds of reasons that the search and rescue resources hadn't gotten there. It's another podcast episode. So they did. They helped him get all the stuff out. And then he was like, "Thanks, I'm leaving." And he left them there to listen to all of their friends die. And they tried to get him out, and they were there for weeks. And what they did was they came together and they founded a union. And it was named after the date of the disaster. And they went to the president of the country, and they had enough political will and political capital because of the suffering everybody together had gone through in the earthquake. And they were able to get the union registered formally for the first time in the country because of the change that had come over them, because of the change that had come over the country. And that's just such a clear example of how these responses can function as ways that lead to really long-term permanent improvements in society.
You talk, and something Jordan said about disasters continuing to happen and getting worse. You talk about wicked disasters. And I had always thought about wicked disasters just being like really complicated problems, that, oh man, multi-layered, but you kind of lay out a different definition of wicked disasters. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? You don't remember?
It's wicked problems.
Wicked problems.
First of all,
wicked problems.
Let's not get the
The disasters are wicked too.
The disasters are wicked because they're made up of wicked problems all over the place. I guess this is where I'm going to feel like I'm talking too much, but I love wicked problems so much that I guess I'm
because it is. I mean, harking back to the time we worked together, I remember you using this term.
Yeah, and I did not understand it. I was totally talking about it without.
And I think you used it incorrectly according to your book.
I did.
No, the night when he found out what it really meant was amazing.
I know.
Like, oh my god!
Oh my god!
Wake up!
He was like, it's epistemological, and I was like,
there were these in the 70s. There were these theorists who were trying to understand how to make a diverse democracy, right? How to bring all of these perspectives together. And what they said was, the thing about a wicked problem is that it's not just complicated. It's not just complex. Coming into that problem with a solution, trying to define it from one perspective, makes it unsolvable, because the problem is created between all of these different perspectives. So anybody that shows up in a room, and I think anybody that's worked on equity issues, anybody that's done a lot of community engagement in a deep way, knows this feeling where you bring together 100 stakeholders. They all have really different perspectives. And if anybody comes in with a solution, it's not going to work. It's like it's a done deal from the get-go. And you have to be able to go through this journey of listening and building a solution from them. And the theorists of wicked problems in the 70s said, you know what? It's actually not possible to solve them. Like, we're screwed, because there's never a time when you can break open the established perspectives and biases that people are coming in with. And the magic of the disasters to us was that it actually created a time like that, like this weird time where people's identity as a disaster survivor overcame some of the other identities they were coming with. And so they could come together in a way that they could be more listening and more humble and find these emergent solutions and learn to know together. And that was only really possible because of the underlying sort of feminist epistemology sort of principles and theories that we were able to bring to those problems.
right. And so we were drawing heavily on two major frameworks sort of in feminist philosophy, right? One is standpoint theory, which is this idea that, and this is, I think, central to wicked problems. Depending on where you're standing, the problem might look different. And I think like COVID's a great example of that we all lived through, right? Depending on where you're standing, COVID is a problem about surging healthcare systems, or it's a problem about the government overstepping on liberty, or it's a problem of like a crisis of healthcare, or it's a problem of race disparity. And all of those things
Or it's not even a problem.
Yeah, it's not even a thing, right? Depending on who is doing the work of telling the story or doing the preparedness, then what the disaster is like a different thing, right? And so this is a little bit Corantelli's thing about the blind men and the elephant, but the feminist philosophers are going to say, right, but it's not just that it's the blind men and the elephant. We also have this second problem, which is that we have these patterns of injustice, with these long-standing patterns that create situations such that these perspectives over here are always going to get uptake, and these perspectives over here are going to be systematically shut out. And so our understanding, for example, of what COVID was going into it reflects who it was that was writing guidance, who it was that was writing plans for what a pandemic was. And I think one of the most pervasive experiences of those first few months of the pandemic was, we can think of just two that were super important, right? One was that shutting down schools, I know this is shocking, but it led to a childcare crisis.
No.
I know. If you'd
Boy,
asked,
did it.
I know. And if you'd asked a feminist, we would have told you guys that was coming.
Yeah.
That's cool. And then second of all, right, the racial disparities that COVID shaped, which were glaringly obvious, right, within, almost immediately, right? But one of the things we read about in the book is the way that like, even as they were becoming apparent, you had, Anthony Fauci at the White House sort of saying, yes, these are a problem, but they're a problem like outside the disaster. Like there just are these racial disparities in health. It's not part of the pandemic. It's this like other thing that's going on. And so again, what the pandemic is would seem to depend on who you ask.
Yeah.
And it depends on the power dynamics that are going on there. So part of what Mitch and I are interested in is that what disasters actually seem to do is they create contexts where, yes, the dominant solution to problems reflect elite perspectives, but also the kinds of like perceptual shifts and emerging communities can lead to excluded voices suddenly getting uptake. And like we saw that really clearly during Black Lives Matter, which successfully reframed what the pandemic was. Remember all of those racism is a public health crisis, right? Racism is a virus signs, right? That was a reframe of the pandemic coming from excluded perspectives that got incredible uptake. One of the things we write about in the book is that before the pandemic, most Black Lives Matter protests were predominantly non-white. And then suddenly, in the summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter protests globally were largely white, majority white. That's a really, really significant shift. And there are lots of theorists who've written about those protests. Very few of them have written about them as the result of something that the pandemic was doing to all of us. And so that's really the thread that Mitch and I pick up, is this idea that we should understand those protests as a reflection of these kinds of shifts, right? Both individual shifts, right? Suddenly being like, oh, I'm open for the first time to this argument about racism, right? But also the collective shifts as people are in new communities learning from one another and so on and so forth, right? Although it's worth saying, some of that is hopeful, and some of that, because we also write in the book, right, about the rise of, reactionary movements, conspiracy theories, authoritarianism. And so those same processes, one of the things we look really closely at is sort of how, if you look at the first 4 months of the pandemic at a week by week basis, you can see the rise of those progressive shifts, but you can also see the rise of the reactionary ones.
And the problem is that in some ways, the reactionary ones have more staying power. They're staying with us longer. And for us, one reason is because our emergency management practices, which we want to feel are neutral. We want to feel that we're apolitical as emergency managers, that we're not putting our thumb on the scale. But because they're designed towards recovering the past, they're always going to juice or give more energy to reactionary energies than the kind of protests we saw for Black Lives Matter. So unfortunately, because we're looking at response and recovery from a backwards nostalgic perspective, we're not neutral. Like we're doing things that are going to help reactionary protests last longer than progressive change does, without meaning to.
We're going to do things that help prop up the traditional, safe, secure, known rebuilding, like the new novel thing,
which unfortunately means that if you're a reactionary group that's like harking back to the past, like I want to bring back a Make America Great Again, bring back this idealized,
bring back
past.
The 80s,
that thing, right? Sure. As long as the cocaine is there. But that's
say as long as Prince is there, but you went in a whole lot.
Wow. I mean, I think Prince and cocaine, they go together. I think it's fair to say. Samuel Prince. I'm talking about Samuel Prince. Reverend Prince. He was a big cocaine.
Although wasn't musician Prince also a reverend? I feel like there was a...
He definitely, probably like multiple times over. He was like at least 7 or 8 times.
Different religions and different...
the whole deal. He made his own.
So how do you change things? How do you make it so that when disasters happen, they change for the better? They can go either way. They change for the better. How do you hold back government who has this pressure to respond, to do things, to solve problems? A lot of times those are best intentions, right? They're good people trying to help people in need, but they're kind of rebuilding this past thing. So how do we change things? How do we give community space to build these networks and to bring about positive change?
Well, the first thing I want to say to that is actually, Andrew, the way that you put that question together is really helpful, I think, for seeing this distinction that we were talking about very early on in our work between sort of like the ethical question and the epistemic question. I know I have to drink because I said that.
I'll do it for you.
Okay, thanks.
Me too.
In that, right, it's the problem that we're naming is not that emergency management sort of has questionable ethical commitments, right? Like I think one of the things that's really, really clear, especially post-COVID, is is this real growth and emphasis on equity, right? On really trying to think about what does a just response look like? So the problem isn't necessarily ethical. The problem is epistemic. The problem is in the habits, tools, and training that we're bringing to conceptualizing what the problems are. That's where this wicked problem thing comes in, right? Yeah. So part of what Mitch and I are getting at is, writing new ethical frameworks, new kinds of guidance, new theories of justice is only going to get us so far if we don't deal with the fact that the sort of, I like this epistemology as it's like logistics, right? The sort of toolkit that we're bringing to say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Mm-hmm. What is the problem here? If that toolkit's flawed, then no theory of justice is going to get us where we want to go.
I think what we saw during COVID was we saw good people stand up and fight for equity, right? Mm-hmm. We saw the federal government put together their long-term plan for equitable recovery and resilience. We saw all kinds of cities stand up for new safety nets and equitable practices. And we aren't saying, just to kind of amplify what you're saying, that there are sort of bad ethical people in there. Right. We're saying people are swimming upstream. Yeah. They're trying to fight against a set of structures that are just more powerful than they are. And every time they think they notch a win, the reason they feel disillusioned and beaten down is because they're being beaten down because they're trapped within an epistemological structure that isn't letting them make the change they want to make. So you're saying, well, how do you make it better?
Yeah.
And so what we're trying to do, and this is hard, and it's blown my brain up. I'm at least 30% more crazy than I was, years ago. Is it in the book, in the podcast, we're trying to tell a story, mm-hmm. and it's almost like solving a mystery. How does Audre Lorde, how does Octavia Butler, how does Christy Dotson and all of these thinkers guide us into new ways to imagine disasters? And then we've got to say, okay, let's take all of that and let's try to put out new rules and guidelines that would invest communities with the resources and ability to imagine new futures. And emergency managers act, in our framing, really like doulas. There's been so much great work on doulas recently and how they guide people through the birth process, and where emergency managers are really not trying to recover you to the past, but trying to guide you on this journey into some kind of new future. That's the pathways and the mystery we're trying to take people through in the book and in the podcast.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's such a great book. It's an important book. I also think it's a very important book as far as an evolution of where the industry is going. I think it's we talked about this on the Dukes podcast, right? It's emergency management is a young kind of discipline. And I think this is an awesome next step for really elevating the industry into what we need to think about. So I'm so glad y'all wrote the book, and it's great. Everybody should read it and become a disaster doula.
I love that. I love that. I'm just grateful our marriage survived.
Me too.
And I don't know why you need me with your aim to deceive me, and you just keep bleeding me dry.
Dude, that was awesome. I enjoy drinking beer, talking to Andrew. Also no shade.
I mean, talking to Andrew is always awesome.
So this season on Tough Shift, we're going to try to tell a story episode by episode, building on each other, trying to make one coherent argument out of the whole season. Next episode, we're going to talk about disaster policy. What is it we're saying is wrong with it? How do we fix it? What are the ways that it's failing us?
Then in episode 3, we're going to talk about how we imagine disasters, including a discussion of disaster movies. In episode 4, we'll talk about the knowledge systems that underpin the way that we understand disasters and the work that they do for us in the world.
And then in episode 5, we're going to break things open and talk about something we call the epistemic watershed, the different perspectives, the different standpoints people are bringing to disasters and how they flux during incidents. That lets us in episode 6 and 7 lay out one particular incident, the 1985 Mexico City earthquake, and break it open, look at its DNA, diagnose how the inflection points happen at each phase of a disaster that lead to positive or negative social change.
That gives us the tools we need to come back and talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. In episode 8, we'll talk about the role of solidarity and social movements in the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing in particular on mutual aid and the Justice for George Floyd protests in 2020. In episode 9, we're going to take a look at the counter example, which is the rise of reactionary social movements in the pandemic. We'll take a look at how our policies tend to sustain those reactionary movements rather than the progressive and transformational ones. Now, this leads us to ask the next question, which is, if we want positive social change in disaster, how should we imagine disaster differently? In episodes 10 and 11, we'll try to answer this question by drawing on resources from science fiction, social movements, and the poetry of Audre Lorde.
Finally, we're going to bring it all back together to think about practical ways that we could change how we handle these crazy events with all of the perceptual shifts and shifts in knowledge they bring, to lay out a pathway into the future that will be better for all of us. It's a hard job. It's kind of depressing, but at the end, we think it's a hopeful journey, and we hope you'll come on it with us on this season of Tough Shift.
Tell me you want me to love you. Tell me you want me to love you. Tell me you want me to love you more.
Tough Shift is produced by me, Mitch Stripling, with original music from Victor. If you like what we're doing, buy the book. You can sign up at disastersandsocialchange.org for a discount code. Stay connected. Stay curious.
Tell me you want me to love you. Tell me you want me to love you more.
Is that a drink from y'all's wedding?
It
the
is
same?
not.
Is the jar from your wedding?
The jar is from our wedding.
still have our
do
jar.
still have a bottle of that stuff in there.
Yeah, we still got the corn whiskey. The corn whiskey
That's
from
awesome.
Georgia.
What's astonishing is that at no point in the pandemic did Mitch and I think this is the time
To break that. If that wasn't the time to break out corn whiskey,
I'm sorry.
will there ever be?
We were not all together all of the nights of the pandemic, so there were times that I dipped into the corn whiskey.
Well
it's
played.
just not gone.
That was
You know?
such a fun wedding. You guys had an awesome wedding.
Yeah,
Uh,
I remember it fondly.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean the parts I can remember. You know,
Yeah. It's good to see you two.
I know it's good to see
We have
you
not
too.
podcasted together since pre-COVID.
was there a pre-COVID?
The last Dukes of Hazzard podcast was before. What'd you say? Was there COVID?
Was there
Was COVID
pre-COVID?
real?
Is it-
Oh, you not heard about COVID?
Oh yeah,
COVID-19?
No, tell me
Yeah,
about-
no,
Oh,
it's-
that was. Isn't that fake news? Isn't that? Did that really
Oh,
happen?
you've changed. You've changed since COVID.
I've just been listening to the internet, right?
Oh, okay.
Everything's true on the internet.
Yeah. That's great. Well, it's great to see you all. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah.
This is like very cool.
Thank you for coming to being our marriage counselor today. We just need to bring a few things to you and get them off our
Since
chest.
COVID, I've switched careers. I'm now a professional marriage counselor.
I think a lot of emergency managers, would be good marriage counselors.
That's
I think
true.
you could, you're dealing with people in crisis.
Yeah.
You're finding solutions, but first you're listening.
Yeah.
It's a real dual
It's a real
career.
crossover.
It's like back to that thing where like event planners, I always thought event planners would be really good crisis managers because, you got to have a plan.
Mhm.
You got to adapt that plan when the day comes.
We did use some ICS for our wedding back in the
That's
day.
right.
Yeah, you gotta pull it out. It's
Yep.
always the tool in the tool.
This sounds like a great Legally Blonde spinoff about an event planner who becomes an emergency
I
manager.
love it.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Mhm.
Ooh,
Mhm.
you should pitch that to Reese.
I know.
She's
I really
she's
should.
there waiting for
Absolutely.
this pitch.
She's
The new
totally
Twisters is coming out. Maybe if the Twisters movie is really good, this will open up a gangbang for disaster movies.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think what was that? Why did you
I don't
go
know
there?
why I use that.
Yeah,
term.
no, I
It's
know.
Weird.
Yeah.
I think what
I'm
this
not-
is
yeah.
opening up is a possible avenue for rom-com disaster movies. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which I really think could bring the rom-com back in like a big way. If all the emergency managers were either event planners or marriage counselors, like it's a whole arc.
Sure.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
And
Yeah.
I can see the titles now, right? Operations Chief. Right? I think that could be a
Yeah.
hot, rom-com title,
Hallmark movie.
Yeah, Liaison Officer.
Mm-hmm.
There it is. Uh-huh.
Liaison in Disaster City.
See, EMI could get on. It could be an EMI joint production with Warner Brothers, and Reese Witherspoon could serve in both roles.
You know,
Love
let's
it.
not write any more books. Let's just make movies.
You could write scripts.